Model, welcome to the virtual summer seminar in entrepreneurship research. And for our audience, Dr. Model Fu is a professor at the National University of Singapore. He has a PhD from MIT, a bachelor's degree from National University of Singapore. He's a field editor at the Journal of Business Venturing and Entrepreneurship Theory and Practice. He's on the editorial review board of many journals, AMJ, AMP, SEJ, and several others. I could go through and through, the list of journals where he has been a guest editor or served as editor. But that suffice it to say that he served the field at the highest levels in terms of the journals. My understanding is he also has honorary professorships at two different universities, Nankai and Jilin. And outside of academia, he worked with the Singapore Armed Forces and the Reserves. He's worked for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Singapore before he came into academia, and was also an officer with Singapore Police Force in his younger days. And he in his email to me, he mentioned that he was not the kind of police officer you often see in the movies or on TV. He was a good police officer. So with that, Model, welcome.
Thank you so much, Visha. Thanks so much for inviting me. Just a small correction. I'm now moved to the Nanyang Technological University.
Okay.
And it's also good, I noticed a few familiar faces, Alka, Goshan, and I think I'm going to see David Rep next week, where I think you're one of the participants of the Entrepreneurship Mid-Career Consortium, of which I'm co-organizing this year.
Perfect. That tells people how small this profession is, right? So before I ask Model my first question, let me also make a personal note here. Model may not remember it, but the first paper I ever published, which was in ETNP, Model gave us friendly review on the paper. And back then I didn't even know him. And he was still willing to take the time to give us friendly review. And of course, that paper was later published in ETNP. And although I didn't realize it at that time, I can say looking back that to be at the level where he's at and still be willing to give friendly review on a paper from a PhD student who he doesn't even know, I mean, that says something about the guy. So thank you, Model. I know I never thanked you for it. Thank you.
Thank you.
So my first question to you, Model, is how did you get to entrepreneurship research? How did you decide to do a PhD? So sort of your life journey to academia.
Well, I really sort of chanced upon academia. I was sort of first generation to attend college. So, didn't even know much about what, university life is, let alone what a professor life is going to be. And, as Visha mentioned, I worked in several places. And one day I happened to talk to a friend who was a graduate teaching assistant. And she described her work. And, I was like, wow, you're paid to kind of explore ideas. And you just basically do whatever you're interested in. And I said, I was working in the civil service. I said, that's the kind of job I want. So I didn't know what academia was. So I went to my PhD because, you need a PhD to become a professor. And then I finished up my comprehensive examinations. Some places call it the qualifying examinations. And I was really, really interested in OB, or organizational behavior issues. So after I finished my qualifying examination, Scott Shane then was a new professor at MIT. So I spoke with Scott, and Scott said, you know what, there wasn't, at that point in time, there wasn't much work on teams in entrepreneurship. So I said, all right, that's my dissertation, right? I knew I wanted to do teams. I knew I was interested in the behavioral perspective. I had no idea what entrepreneurship was. I took a grand total of 0 entrepreneurship classes at the point when I finished my qualifying examination. And so I did a PhD on teams, but I still saw myself primarily as an OB person studying teams. And then as after I graduated, this idea of sort of cognition was very important. And so I said, hey, but a lot of the cognition perspective was really at the individual level. So I said, I could bring in some of the team perspective. So I stayed on and brought in the team perspective in cognition. And then teams research itself became quite important. And so I stayed on and also did teams work. And then, what I always thought was interesting was that people talk a lot about emotions being important in entrepreneurship in the popular literature. But at that point in time, there wasn't much work. So I stayed on and said, let me do a bit work on emotions and entrepreneurship. And after that, kind of more recently broadened it to well-being. So I guess the moral of the story is it's not why I went to entrepreneurship, it's why I never left entrepreneurship. So I never went into entrepreneurship, I just never left. And I think the key take-home point here is entrepreneurship is a very welcoming umbrella. So whether you are from sociology, philosophy, even, economics, even economic geography, there are always interesting questions in entrepreneurship that you can answer and you can look at, even if you don't primarily see yourself as an entrepreneurship scholar. And in fact, in actual fact, up to 10 years ago, when people ask me, what are you? I said, I'm a OB scholar that happens to study entrepreneurship. But no one believes me anymore, right? So I just say I'm an entrepreneurship scholar. Yeah, so that was my entrepreneurship journey, which I went on by chance, just never left the journey.
And Model, there are few people in our group here too who are interested in teams. So don't be surprised if you get an email from one of them after this session, reaching out to you. That there are PhD students here interested in teams and entrepreneurship. But my next question to you is, tell us about one entrepreneurship paper of your choice that you've published and sort of the journey from idea to publication.
So I picked a paper which I co-published with Rebecca Funken and Michael Glinick. And the title of the paper is How Can Problems Be Turned into Something Good? The Role of Entrepreneurial Learning and Error Mastery Orientation. This paper was published in ETP last year. And the reason why I chose this paper was because this paper was published using the dissertation of Rebecca Funken. So in that sense, how did the paper come about? Well, the paper came about was, so Rebecca was doing her dissertation, and Michael Glinick, and those of you who knows the work of Michael Glinick and Michael Frazee, you know that they do a lot of sort of training / consulting / research in Africa. So Rebecca tagged along and helped Michael Frazee and Michael Glinick to do this research. So that's, and because she was doing this research, that became part of her dissertation. And one of the interesting things that Rebecca was kind of looking at was problems, right? That, entrepreneurs face a lot of problems along the way. And then, and then she really kind of found that, problems sometimes will lead to better venture outcomes, sometimes worse venture outcomes. So I guess there was kind of a practical significance of that paper. But again, to publish a paper, you needed a sort of a theoretical perspective. But Rebecca was saying, well, and even Michael Glinick was saying, yeah, it was an interesting paper. It was, practically important to understand this question, but there wasn't a puzzle. So we'll just use this for Rebecca dissertation, and then that will be the end of the paper, right? But then that's where I came in. I said, well, I think there is a puzzle there, right? And the puzzle was, entrepreneurs face a lot of problems, but problems by definition isn't a good thing, right? And we hear about startups being sort of a resource constraint. issues of legitimacy. So how can problems be a good thing? But yet, at the same time, we know a lot of the work on lean startup, and they're talking about how you are supposed to face problems, and then you learn from there, and then you improve along the way, and that will help your venture. So to me, there was a puzzle, right? There was kind of two very different perspectives about what problem was. One is, by definition, a problem is a bad thing, right? I mean, no one wants to have problems with your paper, no one wants to have problems in going through your PhD program. You know, we just don't want problems, right? The other hand, the lean startup says that problem is a good thing. So that's how we wrote the paper. I think it was rejected by JBV. That was in the first instance, and because we drew primarily on the failure literature. And the reviewers say, problems are important, yes, but but that's not failure, right? Failure is really a very extreme case. So as we saw the feedback, we revised the paper, and we drew more from issues of setbacks. So things like disasters and other situations whereby entrepreneurs face setbacks, but the setbacks is not final like a failure. So that sort of, the paper sort of went relatively well. So I think the key point that I wanted to kind of bring out is, as you think through your dissertation, think through what's the key puzzle that you want to answer out of it, and then work with your professors, and I think together a good piece of work can come out of it. So the ETP review, fortunately, was kind of relatively smooth, but of course it was rejected by JVB and maybe some other places I cannot remember.
So Model, what I heard you say was how the theoretical anchoring of this paper was sort of an iterative process to find. Mm-hmm. You thought this was a theoretical anchoring, and then, based on the reviewer's feedback, you decided that was not the proper theoretical anchoring and that you needed to change it. Is that an accurate description?
Yes, that was an accurate description. Yeah.
So I bring this up. Go ahead.
Yeah. So initially we were anchoring around, some of Dean Shepard's work. So Dean Shepard, Don Detain, they all did some work on sort of failure, right? So we anchored along this literature, but then we kind of shifted a little bit, and then anchored on some of, well, again, Dean Shepard. So Dean Shepard and I think it's Townsend or someone else, they do a lot of work on disasters, which is sort of significant events, setbacks that entrepreneurs face, yet they manage to solve it. So we changed the anchoring a little bit. Although the big picture that I mentioned at the start, that didn't change as much.
Yeah, recently one of our participants was asking me, how do you decide the theoretical anchoring? So I think what you described is very, very useful in that regard. Now let me switch gears a little bit. As a reviewer and editor, and you've served in both roles, what do you look for in a paper? How do you decide if a paper has potential or not?
Mm-hmm. So I think, I was thinking about it and say, what are the three main problems that I see in many papers? I think the first is that, and the good thing is, I think it was very consistent with, I think, the previous few speakers. I actually listened to like four to five speakers to prepare for today's session, and learned a lot on the sessions. And I think what was consistent among all the speakers was that you first have to paint the situation, right? I remember one of your speakers called it the ABCD, right? I forgot what the A is, but I used the pyramid principle, and I call it the situation. And the situation is important, as one of the previous speakers mentioned, and I totally agree, is because it lays out which conversation you are tackling. So very often, because entrepreneurship is sort of a phenomenon, right? But within that phenomena, there are groups of conversations. So the situation tells essentially the reader, the reviewer, and the editor which conversation that you are going into. And then from there, what is the complication? What's the issue around that situation that is insufficient, right? And of course, he has to be insufficient and he has to be important, right? I also recall one of your speakers mentioned that it cannot be a gap, because gap itself doesn't matter. There are gaps everywhere, right? A lot of things have not been studied, right? So it is a gap, yes, but it's an important gap, and how you resolve the gap. And I recall one of the speakers mentioned also, and then the last part is how then your research helps to orient future research in that area. So that's one thing that I see missing in a lot of paper. They assume that we know the situation. They assume we know why the gap is important. They assume that once they got the results, we will know what it means for future research in that stream. So that's not so obvious. So that I think is point one, which I think a lot of speakers mentioned. Point two is spend time collecting good data. The number of times papers get rejected because the data is bad, one-time data collection, measures the proxies do not fit with the conceptual things. And I advise students that, if you're going to spend 3 months doing nothing, or even 6 months doing nothing but doing good data collection, that is time well spent, because you're going to spend years writing the paper. Right? So 6 months, 3 months is time well spent. Collect good data. And then the third issue we see is a poor theory versus data fit. Because sometimes, especially I see that among sort of the more junior researchers, that they come up with a very interesting question and they say, I want to answer it, but well, it may be an interesting question, but if your data is not there, then you can only answer the question that your data has, right? I remember Laura Huang, I recall listening to a talk, and she talked about data and theory and data fit, and that I recall she said she'll reject the paper if there's no theory data fit, and I see that very frequently.
So those are the three things that you look for in a paper. Before we turn to the audience questions, I have one more question for you, and that is, can you tell us about one entrepreneurship paper that you're working on these days, and sort of where do you see it? How do you intend to take it forward?
Yeah, so I chose a paper that I'm also working with a PhD student, and this paper started with, so I taught a PhD class, well, actually just a few months ago and last year. I should, done something like Visha is doing, right? I had like 6 students, right? Visha has like over 100 students. So, so we did that last year, and so that was in January last year, and of course the hot topic at that time, January last year, which unfortunately is still today, COVID. So I told the students, I said, let's try something fun, right? Let's do machine language, which I knew nothing about, but everyone's talking about it. Let's do machine language, and let's do something relating to COVID. And since COVID, there's a lot of emotional ups and downs, and it's also my research area. The student decided that, and it was also her area, and she said, okay, let's see how emotions and COVID can be linked using machine language. But as we worked through the paper, we decided that the machine language was still interesting, the emotions was still interesting, the COVID wasn't so interesting, so we dropped that. So basically, what that paper was looking at is how different kinds of emotions activation influence the amount of crowdfunding. So I think to me there are a few learning lessons from here. One is always try, if you have a term paper in your entrepreneurship class, try to use that as an opportunity to explore an idea for a real paper. So even though the idea would change a lot, even though the data might change a lot, PhD classes term papers are always a fantastic time to try ideas. If anything, because the professor have no choice but to give you feedback. Yeah. Yeah, so that's what we are still working on, and we worked over it for like, yeah, really a year, because we still trying to publish it. We haven't submitted it, but we were thinking, trying for the best journals and keeping our fingers crossed. Yeah.
And Modern, I really like your advice. I tell PhD students here that every term paper, they should try to at least take it to a conference and some sort of journal submission.
Agreed. Yes.
And I think that's a good mindset for PhD students to have. Given how difficult it has become to publish papers, that's a missed opportunity if they don't do that. So thank you very much.
And the time it takes is very long, and the idea only improves with more feedback.
Yep. Now we have questions from the audience, so I'll ask with Mike. Do you want to ask your first question?
Yes, thank you, Dr. Gupta. And thank you, Dr. Fu, as well. So glad that you're here. And I had an opportunity some years ago to be in Singapore with my wife, and it's just a wonderful place. I just really enjoyed it so much. So my question is regarding your work that you did recently about a special issue on emerging economies, too, about entrepreneurship, and about how often we're studying US-based or Western European-based entrepreneurship. And yet your article is talking about resource mobilization that happens in emerging markets. And I'm really curious to find out more about that.
Well, yeah, so that's a special issue together with I think Visha and forgot Brian. Yeah, so Visha from INSEAD and Brian from Michigan. Yeah, so I think one of the things that I really think that the emerging regions is where a lot of the exciting research is coming. So yeah, I mean that's what I think, and I also think that so I'm doing an R&R now, right? And one of the review so I wouldn't say which Middle Eastern country in case maybe a reviewer is out here, but the reviewer said, what's the generalizability issue because you're studying a Middle Eastern country? And in my mind was like, if I study Stanford or California or Boston or Chicago, no one asks me about generalizability, although those are kind of very unique economies. So I think my take-home point today is when I respond to those kind of comments now, I respond it as as a positive, because it gives you the theoretical sort of boundaries about what the theory is. Yeah. Yeah, so sorry, Mike, I'm not sure whether I answered your question, but I really think that a lot of the research in emerging regions are exciting, and the fact that they are from different regions is a plus and not a generalizability issue. In fact, it gives you the theoretical boundaries, pushes the theoretical boundaries.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Mike.
And Modern, having done some research in outside the US myself, I echo your point, which is a lot of times reviewers and editors will say, what's the generalizability of this study, this data that you collected in, I'm just going to say, let's say India. And I'm like, when I published that North America paper, nobody asked me that question.
Yes.
And I think some of it is reflective of the fact that 95% or 90% of editors and reviewers are located in North America. And one of the things I was hoping with an audience like this is that people from among this audience will take up reviewer and editorial roles at our journals, so that question becomes moot about what's the generalizability.
Yes, yeah. But also I think in responding today, I would kind of very gently point out that it's actually a positive thing. So when I started replying this kind of things 20 years ago, I tended to be very apologetic, like, yeah, I'm sorry, it's not the typical North American sample. But today I'm a little bit more politely pointing out that is a positive aspect.
Yeah. So we have more questions. So Sadek, do you want to go next?
Thank you, Dr. Gupta. Thank you, Dr. Fu. I have been in Singapore to join Telenor Singapore, almost there, but I started my PhD taking a U-turn. And so your talk is very interesting, and you spoke about Dr. Freeze, and so they do a lot of entrepreneurship training, right? So I have a specific interest on that, and I was interested to know that how do you think it's is it a good project to undertake for a PhD student, where because training takes a long time, right? Probably like 6 months, and then longitudinal data, and then I might end up in not publishing or just submitting to a journal when I am end of my PhD journey. I am going to start my second year. So what's your opinion about that? Like, should we be ambitious enough to undertake that kind of project, or we should look into database? Like, I am personally very passionate about experimental designs and more into the trainings. So I wanted to know your thoughts about that.
Yeah. So actually, if you're gonna, so a lot of the training, like for example, Michael Frazee does, right, and a lot of my work on experience sampling methodology. So it's really about 3 months, and it can be as short as 2 weeks. So I would say definitely go for that, because I mean, if you're a PhD student, then I don't suggest 6 months, right? But if you look at a typical incubator training programs, it's also about 12 weeks, right? And some of them are as short as 8 weeks. If you push it, maybe 6 weeks. But I would say 8 weeks is reasonable. So I would say you should go for it. 8-week training program, sort of an 8-week kind of design. And if those 8 weeks, all you do is data collection, is well worth it. And then you have very good data, because you can change your if you have 8 weeks worth of data, right? There's so many type of analysis that you can do. I guarantee you will find something interesting, right? So I can guarantee you. If you have a good design, you'll find something in an 8-week data collection, and then you can change your analysis, you can change your theorizing, but you have a nice set of data. So I always see a paper as like polishing a piece of diamond, whereby, of course, polishing is very important, but at the end, inside, it has to be a real diamond, right? So 2 months, up to 3 months, even 4 months, no issue. That will not hold back your dissertation, and you will have a nice diamond to polish.
Thank you so much.
So both have questions so far have come from men. So I think it's good that we give the next question to a woman. So Hemanidhi, do you want to ask your question?
Yes, sir. Thank you so much, Professor, for the opportunity. Actually, I'm also working on entrepreneurial teams, and I have read your papers on new venture teams in the past. I mean, when I was doing my literature review. So what I have seen in your papers, it's the data collection. I was talking to Professor Gupta also a few days back. The data collection is one of the challenges that I'm facing in my study. When I look into your papers, you have 51 teams data. And I just want to know from you, is there any kind of reviews when you submitted your papers? Was there any kind of reviews which talked about that you are doing empirical study and you have 51 teams data, and how you're going to justify your data, the results, how you're going to justify that? I just want to know about this. And the second question, if I'm allowed to ask you, just taking this opportunity to ask you this question. Second question that I'm going to ask you, because right now you were talking about that how you came up with the studies that you did in the beginning, that there was some kind of theoretical, some Rebecca's thesis work was there. How I came up with my study right now that I'm doing currently is based on the thesis also, that I came up with the thesis. The idea came from the thesis, and there is not a big work that has been done in that particular field. So how I'm going to justify that how I should justify that, when I'm publishing my paper, that from where I got this gap. Is it important to write about it, or just coming up with some kind of literature gaps or like that? Yeah.
Okay, so I think the second, I'll take the second question first, because if I paraphrase correctly, the issue is there is not much work related to your dissertation. Is that
Yes.
accurate? Okay.
Yes. Yes.
So every research paper needs to go into a conversation. So you need to know what the closest conversation, because so somebody must be interested in the conversation. So when I first started doing research on emotions, there wasn't a lot of people doing emotions work, right? I mean, there was a spattering. So I do not start my paper with the emotion audience, because it's unlikely, because there was a smattering, but there wasn't a lot. So I always started with how cognition influences decision making, but emotions influences decision making. And so if you're interested in cognition, you cannot ignore emotions. Okay, so if you have a new area, you need to think about, because your reviewers are going to be, people in the quote unquote old areas, right? You can't run away from that. So you have to think about which people in the old area would be interested in your work, and how does your work inform them. Okay, so you need to do that, right? So today when I write an emotions paper, I say emotions is important in entrepreneurship, and then I don't talk about cognition anymore, right? So I guess the short answer is, yes, you still have to go to a conversation, see who is your likely conversation, and how do you extend their understanding. I hope that helps. The second question, the first question, I didn't get too much. If I paraphrase, are you asking how do you justify just having 51 teams? Is that your question?
Yes, because you did empirical research in that.
Yes.
And doing it with less data, I mean, was there any kind of review from the reviewers that this is a less data that you're working on and you're doing empirical research? How do you justify that?
Yeah. So I think the good thing about team research is that, reviewers tend to be a little bit more understanding. We know we can't get like 300 data points, right? But having said that, I do advise students. So I do advise students, even when they do team research, to go closer to 100 even today. And what I typically advise them, if they're doing it for their dissertation, I say, well, for a dissertation, 50 plus seems reasonable. But, even as you're working on a dissertation, continue to collect the data. And some of the data can be collected even after you finish your dissertation. So my suggestion would be, for a dissertation, 50 plus is enough. For publication, I would just continue to collect data, and by the time you finish writing the paper, finish analyzing it, giving your friends for feedback, and 2-3 rounds, presenting in a conference, you have collected another 50. And then when you say for publication, is 100.
Thank you so much.
Skylar, do you want to ask next? Skylar?
Okay, thank you, Professor. Thank you, Professor. Thank you, Professor. I have a question about the longitudinal model of emotion or mood or affect. The emotion or mood or affect is not static, they're not snapshot. It's dynamic by definition. It's a movie. And for example, the Maryland's paper begin to study the affect span. So my question is about how do you feel about the idea about how the emotion or affect trajectory impact like the engagement trajectory or ventral goal trajectory? And for the method, the deep learning method, like the state-of-art machine learning method, I guess could be used to capture the daily emotion, and we could use that method to examine how the emotion change impacts the entrepreneurial process and outcome. How do you feel about that, Professor?
Wow, yeah, it's a little hard to kind of, okay, so it's hard to see what your puzzle is right now, so it's hard to answer, but I can tell you a few things that is interesting. I mean, first, you talk about FX spin, as you mentioned here, my paper with Marilyn. So clearly, FX spin is very understudied, and yet is important because FX spin will affect your sort of psychological resources. I would say that the engagement, in fact, I have one paper now looking at engagement. And typically we find entrepreneurship that engagement tends to go down, right? Because initially it's exciting, and then after that you face problems, and then your sort of engagement level goes down. So I think those two things are interesting, but I think it's hard to. But I think you still need to work on what is the puzzle. So that part would probably need a little bit more thinking about. The machine language would also be interesting. In fact, as I mentioned, right, the PhD student paper that I'm working on right now, we are using kind of machine language for that purpose too. Yeah. So I'll say interesting questions, but still more work needs to be done on clarifying what that puzzle is.
You mean the puzzle about the topic of emotion? And what is the current gap in that study so we can better communicate to that conversation?
Yeah. So the puzzle here is so if you say FX spin has an effect on engagement, is there something surprising about it? Is there something new? Is there something new that you can tell the audience? So that part I think needs to be worked on. So again, remember I was telling about the situation, right? This is the current situation, and there's something wrong in the current situation. So I think what's still missing is there's something missing in the current situation that you're trying to solve. So that part needs to be worked out in a little bit more detail.
Okay, thank you. Really inspirational. Thank you, Professor.
Aurobindo, do you want to go next?
Thank you, Professor. Professor Mo, I am the PhD student of Michael Gielnik, and actually nice to hear you and your work. Actually, my question is to be a reviewer, like what are the criteria or to be a good reviewer at the PhD stage?
Okay, so you should ask Michael. So say hi to Michael for me. So actually, part of the thing I do because I'm an editor too. So part of the thing I do when I do a PhD class is I make my students, I train my students on how to do reviews, and then I make them do some practice reviews. And then after I'm comfortable with that, you do real reviews. So my advice to you is ask Michael, how can I start the review process? And I think one of the big issues I see for, and there's actually a trick, right? Because every review is about 2 pages. You talk about major points, you talk about minor points. And one of the things that I see the issue with beginning reviewers is they are too much into the methods and the details, but they forget what the big picture is. So my suggestion is focus on the big picture, like 6 to 8 points. And then after, at least 1 page of that, or even one slightly more than a page, and then maybe 3/4 pages on a little bit of nitpicking. Yeah, but I would suggest, in your case, definitely reach out to Michael Gielnik and say, hey, Michael, I'm interested to be a reviewer. Can you guide me? Can we do a couple of practice reviews? And I tell you an easy way, right? Because Michael is an editor, but he's also a reviewer, right? And he's busy. Say, Michael, maybe there's a paper that you are reviewing right now. Maybe show it to me. I will do a first draft of a review so that when you review the paper, it's much easier. You don't have to read as much because I've done some work for him, right? And then you do a few practice, and Michael will say, okay, this is your review. This is what I like about it, what I don't like about it. And then you learn this process. And you do that 2 or 3 times. And after that, you're more comfortable. And then you ask Michael, can can I do a real review for you?
Yeah, thank you, Professor.
Vrinda, do you want to go next?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Gupta. Thank you, Dr. Fu. It was a lovely talk. My question is on justifying emerging markets. And I found your paper with Dr. Visa very interesting. So when, yeah, I'm a junior scholar. So when I start writing, how do I, talk about emerging markets and how do I justify that?
Mm. And what perspective do you take? Like the OB perspective, a strategy perspective?
No, OB perspective and gender entrepreneurship. So
gender entrepreneurship. Yeah.
yes.
Okay. Yeah.
So
So I mean, yeah. So if it's gender, for instance, then of course, Visha is the expert on gender, and I mean, so I would kind of talk a little bit about whether there's, for instance, go to the globe studies, right, and see whether there are sort of different sort of gender expectations, gender roles. So I will still kind of look at those things first to explain. So it still has to be so although it's emerging market. The explanation still has to be a theoretical explanation. So maybe gender roles are different in emerging markets, and even for emerging markets, I would also advise not to do a study and just say about emerging markets, right? I'll be more specific. Is it India? Is it Africa? Right? Is it South America? Okay, because emerging markets is really a very broad brush. So I would go more specific. Talk about the country that you are studying and how maybe the gender norms may be different in those countries, and how that might play out in the explanation of whatever you want to study. Yeah. So I guess don't just say emerging markets. Be a bit more specific.
So if I take up India, then I explain India through
yes
several things.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes.
So India,
and when you mean a theoretical perspective, what if you can just elaborate that bit?
Yeah. So in the case of gender, right? Are gender roles in India different? Are gender expectations different? So those were the things that I would discuss.
Okay. Right. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Now, Model, I know we asked you for 45 minutes. Are you willing to take a few more questions?
Oh, sure. I'll be delighted.
Perfect. Alexander, do you want to ask?
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Gupta. Hello, Dr. Fu. I have a question to you regarding one of the research projects I have. And I've been working about like 1 year. There is a theory in applied psychology which explain the difference in decision making, and actually they explains like two biases. And the source of the bias for the female and male is actually the difference in the cost of the error. So there is a different cost of the error. That's why the male and female make the different decision how to select the partner. And I thought this is exactly the theory which can be applied for entrepreneurship to explain the diet of the venture capitalist and the startup developer. Because one has the high cost of the error, and the other actually can pitch the new idea, new startup probably each month, and just to make a nice presentation. And I was thinking to merge this with multi-level theory of decision making. It's a very old theory like a Hollenbeck and others, to explain the decision making accuracy. So there is like a core construct which explains the decision making accuracy, and I thought that these two biases, the gender generated biases, will actually moderate the relationship between the core construct. Do you think I'm selecting the proper DV and the proper theory for the main effect? And that's the first question. And the second question, do you believe that such research design can fly as a theoretical, fully conceptual paper? Or to prove it, I need to collect about 100 teams and present also the empirical evidence? Thank you for your conceptual and applied answer.
Yeah. Yeah, I think Visha mentioned, right? I think you mentioned it in your talk, and I totally agree that I think it's good to go for empirical paper first for PhD students because it's tremendously difficult to publish a conceptual paper. So my short answer is, especially a topic like biases and gender, there's been quite a lot of theorizing. So I think it's often difficult to write a theory paper around it. So I would definitely suggest empirical paper. And I know you mentioned about teams. I mean, but the theoretical issue is still about the cost of the error, right? And male and female. So if you design an empirical paper, it may not need to be a team paper. It can be at the individual level, right? Because it's really about the biases. Yeah. The part that I didn't really get was how does the multi-level play in this picture? Because what I hear from you is that for males and females, there are differences in the cost of the errors, and therefore the VC would make decisions differently. Is that right?
Yeah, so basically, there is a theory in applied psychology which explains how the male and female behave differently. The main idea is to use this theory to say that actually the person who pitched the project, it's a male because he or she has the low cost of error, and the venture capitalist has a high cost of error. That's why actually they take the female type of a bias. And so basically saying that the venture capitalist, it's a female, and the startup developer, it's a male. And I was asking what would be the best theory to use these two biases as a moderators. For example, I was thinking about like a main effect on the decision-making accuracy, and there is a theory which explain how the team make better decisions. And maybe you can advise like another theory which can be merged with this, the main idea. Thank you.
Yeah, so I mean, offhand, I cannot tell you a theory, but what I do suggest is to look at the work of Laura Huang. So Laura, of course, was one of your guest speakers, I think, last week or a couple of weeks ago. So Laura does a lot of work about how men and women sort of present their ideas differently, and there are different sort of expectations of men and women. And because of this, the investors have different preferences for men and women. So instead of saying a particular theory, I would say go look at sort of Laura Wang's work, and I think you get a lot of good ideas on how to proceed.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Ashika, you want to go next?
Thank you, Professor Gupta. Hello, Professor Fu. So actually, my question is just part up on Haimanidhi's question. I just wanted to know if there's an experiment on teams, and let's say if it's a 2x5, okay? And then for every cell, we're trying to, what is the ideal number to have for every cell? Because if it's a team, even if I have, let's say 5 members in a team, so that'll probably make my number to, if I have, let's say 10 teams per cell, that'll make the number to what? 50 into 10, 500. So what's the ideal number per cell for a team that we should have for a dissertation?
Yeah. Well, that's a tough question, right? Because when you do analysis, right, if your team is your analysis, then your power statistics do not change just because you have a team, right?
Exactly. And then per cell, they say that minimum should be 30. But then if I put 30 with 5 members, that's 150, and then that's 1,500 people.
Yeah.
It's almost impossible.
Yeah. So, I'm a team researcher, but sometimes I cheat a little bit. And what do I mean by cheating? By looking at an individual issue within a team. And then my unit analysis becomes the individual. So I'll change my research questions slightly. So for instance, instead of saying, how passion in the team, influences, say, outcomes, and then it's a team level construct, I would study about, how each individual sort of deviation from the team sort of average influences that first sort of venture outcomes, right? So if my sort of independent, if my IV is each individual's deviation from the mean of the team, then really it's an individual level analysis. Yeah. So if you want to do something like this, I would suggest seeing whether you can study an issue of an individual embedded in a team. Yeah, because statistics won't change just because you're doing a team level analysis, right? Yeah.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
Sridhar, you want to go next?
Thank you, Professor Gupta. Thank you, Professor Pope.
Hi.
I'm a research scholar in OB, and I'm doing research on self-managed teams from India. My question is, do you think that self-managed team exists in entrepreneurship also?
I'm sorry, I missed your question. The last part. Do I think?
Do you think that self-managed teams exist in entrepreneurship also? When the entrepreneur is in the infant stage, or when it is very small, where the startups are there.
Yeah.
So it definitely it's a self-managed team.
Yeah. So if I paraphrase, do I think that self-managed teams in entrepreneurship, is that accurate?
Yes.
Yeah. So actually that would be an excellent research question. In fact, I didn't get down to doing it because of the lack of resources. But one of the things that I wanted to look at was that the idea of shared leadership in startup teams. So definitely those are kind of, it's an ideal context to study self-managed team, right? I mean, one of the things I like to show when I teach my OB class is the Orpheus Orchestra, where there's no sort of a conductor, right? And in some sense, a startup is like this, right? There's no real conductor, and yet all the team functions, all the has to be performed, and it's not necessarily performed by one individual, but it's distributed within the different team members. Yeah, so that's actually a very ideal setting to study questions of shared leadership, self-management of teams.
I'm doing that, and I'll come back to you. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
So, Model, we are getting close to an hour of your time, so I'm going to transition into the last question, which is, what is one advice you have for aspiring entrepreneurship researchers?
Wow. I think entrepreneurship, among the many divisions, even in academy, is one of the most welcoming divisions. And part of the reason why I never left. So my typical advice for the people is that, regardless of your theoretical perspective, regardless of whether you see yourself an entrepreneurship scholar or you just happen to be one like me, always keep at least one foot in the entrepreneurship door, because whatever your theoretical perspective, I can bet you that there is a question in entrepreneurship research that is waiting for you to answer.
Great. Thank you, Model. On that note, thank you very much for your time today, and we really appreciate you patiently answering everyone's questions.
Right. Thanks you, Visha. Thanks so much for inviting me. It's been fun and good to see everyone.
And I know it's late night there, so have a good night.
Thanks. Okay. Thanks, everyone. Bye.